Ladies and gentlemen, we completed the last chapter with the discussion of the Wilson cycle that we see here again with the various stages of the breakup of continents, formation of new oceanic basins, the eventual closure of such basins and continent collision, which completes the cycle. Today and in the next chapter 2, we want to discuss some aspects of Wilson cycle plate tectonics in the context of a South African example of the formation of the Cape Fold Belt. We see here where the Cape Fold Belt sits. It is along the southern coast of South Africa from roughly close to East London to Cape Town and a little bit along the west coast. And what is shown here in blue colors, this is the main rock unit that forms the Cape Mountains, the Cape Fold Belt. This would be the Cape Supergroup. Grahamstown is located here at the northeastern end, right at the border between the Cape Fold Belt to the nearby Karoo. You know, north of us is the Karoo Supergroup rocks. Widespread here in South Africa, all these rocks that you see in brown colors and in these greenish colors also here, Lesotho region. All that is Karoo Supergroup. We want to talk about the evolution of the Cape Supergroup, which is older and which, as I mentioned, is the main unit in the Cape Fold Belt. Let's have a look at the history of the Cape Fold Belt. There are 4 important phases. The first one is an older orogenic mountain building event, the Pan-African orogeny, which lasted from the latest Proterozoic to the very early Phanerozoic, 600 to 500 million years. That is the history of an old mountain building event which, as the name suggests, affected large parts of Africa. We see it in Namibia, we see it in Central Africa, all over the place. This was a large collisional event, a continent-continent collision at that time. This mountain belt, the Pan-African orogeny, was reduced by erosion at the time when then in a shallow water environment the Cape Supergroup was deposited, and that happened in the Paleozoic from the Ordovician Silurian into Devonian time at about 450 to 380 million years ago. The Cape Orogeny, that means the deformation of these sedimentary rocks that formed in the Paleozoic. The deformation during the Cape Orogeny happened later, between about 310 and 210 million years. That formed the Cape Fold Belt. That formed these structures and rocks and metamorphic rocks that we now see here along the southern coast in our region, here where we are, and also all the way to Cape Town and further up. The Cape Orogeny and the formation of these structures, folds and faults and various others that we are going to see, was then followed by a 4th stage, the breakup of Gondwana, and that happened in the later Mesozoic, about 130 to 150 million years ago here in our region. Let's have a look at the map again. We see here, as I said, in blue colors, the Cape Supergroup, which makes up a large part of the Cape Fold Belt, but we also see so-called inliers. These are relics of the Pan-African origin that are very well exposed here in the Cape Town area, but also in smaller areas around George and here north of Oudtshoorn. These orange parts, also here is a small one not far from PE. This is part of the basement, of the underlying Pan-African basement onto which the Cape Supergroup was deposited in this time, 450 to 380 million years ago. Then we see here in yellow color some structures, some younger structures. These are of Jurassic and Cretaceous age. These are sedimentary basins that are related to Gondwana breakup, to extensional tectonics, which led to the formation of the Indian Ocean, which we find right at our doorstep here along the southern coast and all the way down to Antarctica. We are going to discuss all these various processes now in context, but we are going to focus on the history of the Cape Supergroup, its deposition, and its later deformation during the Cape Orogeny. Here we see some schematic sketches of processes reaching back to 1 billion years through the Proterozoic history and then to the early Paleozoic history. At that time, the coastline of southern Africa, of southern Gondwana, Proto-Gondwana we call it here, was much further south. And it was an Andean-type plate margin, as we see it today in South America. We had the subduction of oceanic lithosphere, and during that event, the Pan-African belt was forming. So here it was an Andean-type orogen. In other parts of Africa, it was a real continent-continent collisional orogen. Here we see that in the cross-section, shortening of the crust happened, thickening of the crust, and there was also a magmatic arc at the time, somewhere associated with this margin. North of it we saw the Kalahari Craton, which unified the Namakwa-Natal metamorphic province, which we find today in Natal and also in the Northern Cape, and the much older Cape Craton, which makes up the basement of central South Africa, Johannesburg area, all over there. This is the Kapval Craton forming that part of the crust. So in the western part, in the Northern Cape and Western Cape, the basement consists of the Namakwa-Natal province, overlain by younger rocks, by various sequences of younger rocks. So Kalahari Craton and the Pan-African belt attached south to it in a situation similar to what we see today along the South American west coast. Later then we evolve to the Gondwana configuration. This is then the latest Proterozoic, about 600 million years ago, with an extensional phase. So this contractional environment during the Pan-African orogeny was giving way to extensional tectonics, where we form a back-arc basin, and we have talked about back-arc basins briefly, with probably continuous subduction and perhaps also magmatic activities. But in the back-arc we see extension. The southern part of this Kalahari Craton and Pan-African orogenic belt is undergoing extension, and this forms a sedimentary basin. Into this basin, the Cape Supergroup is deposited. And this is the material that later will be deformed and metamorphosed during the Cape Orogeny, and that is the event that we actually want to talk about. Here we see the environment in which the Cape Supergroup forms as sedimentary rocks. The crust was probably thinned out, the continental crust, but there is no indication whatsoever that this stage reached the formation of new oceanic lithosphere. So this is still continental crust, continental lithosphere. In the north, to the north of a probably continuous subduction-related environment. Today we don't really know much about this area because this crustal block that we see here has been removed during Gondwana breakup. We come back to that a bit later. So this extensional back-arc basin was filled. It was filled in the early Paleozoic. We have seen that here during Ordovician and Silurian and Devonian times. That is this period with the back-arc basin and sediment deposition and lithification in this extensional basin. Now we step in time forward to the time at around 300 to roughly 200 million years. This is the time when the Cape Supergroup rocks, which are shown here in dark gray colors, sitting on top of the Pan-African basement, when they undergo contractional tectonics and form what we call a fold and thrust belt. The Cape Fold Belt is tectonically, in its classification, a fold and thrust belt. And this is a result of horizontal shortening. We see here the subduction of oceanic lithosphere. We will see this is the so-called Panthalassa Ocean that is undergoing subduction underneath the southern Gondwana margin. And from where we are now in this region to the continental margin, probably a large belt of maybe 1,000 kilometers width that we don't know today. There might have been an arc, and I believe this subduction zone actually should be much steeper, because you have to bring these rocks here into 100 kilometers depth in order to cause magmatic processes, magmatic arc processes. However, what we see here and what is of interest for us now is the contraction in the back arc. Here is the arc, this region is the back arc, and here we are thickening the crust along these folds, where slices of rock are transported upwards and upwards and upwards, and this thickens the crust, it piles up the crust, and we form a high mountain range. We still see some of this high mountain range today, but the mountains certainly were much larger and probably much higher, more like the Andes. What happened during this piling up of material, this stacking of thrust slices, is in the thickening of the overall crust here in the southern Gondwana area, was a loading. Material was transported to the north along these thrusts while the crust was undergoing thickening, and this caused a bending downwards, an elastic flexure of the foreland. This is here what we would call the foreland, and in this foreland the lithosphere made such a little basin, and into that basin sediments were deposited, and these sediments are the Karoo supergroup. So here we have the Cape Supergroup in dark gray, which is older, early Paleozoic, and then during the latest Paleozoic and the Mesozoic, the Karoo sediments, the Karoo Supergroup, is deposited into that basin that was caused by the piling up of the Cape Supergroup in the fold and thrust belt. So if you load this area, you bend down the lithosphere, and the bending, this elastic bending makes space. It pushes downwards the topography and into that basin. In a continental environment, the Karoo sediments were deposited. This is what we call a foreland basin. This here is the forearc. Here is the arc, and here we reach the back arc, and in the back arc we don't form a back arc basin because that would require extension. We have contraction now here with the fold and thrust belt. But the loading makes space for sediments, and this kind of basin we call foreland basin. And the Karoo currently is interpreted as a large foreland basin forming in that time due to the piling up, due to the thrusting and folding of the Cape Supergroup, forming the Cape Orogen. So there is a strong genetic linkage between the Cape Orogeny and the formation of the Karoo basin. Let's have a look at the larger geological context of this time, of this situation. We see here the Permian situation 250 million years ago, and we see here that is in the early stage of the Cape Orogeny. The Karoo basin is starting to form. What was the overall situation? At this time we had the unification of the northern continents, Laurasia, with the southern continents, Gondwana, and this was called Pangaea. Pangaea means all continents, the whole world was united as a large landmass, and this large landmass was surrounded by a large oceanic basin, because obviously the continents didn't fill the whole globe, they are too small, and consequently they are surrounded by this ocean, which had the name Panthalassa. At the southern Gondwana margin, or southern Pangaea margin, and its western margin, we see this massive, large Andean-type orogenic belt. These were not passive continental margins, these were active continental margins, underneath of which Panthalassa the Panthalassa oceanic lithosphere was subducted. So we see here the Andes are still in such a situation. Here these west coasts, also parts of the North American coasts are still in a very comparable situation, like they were 250 million years ago. But here we see where South Africa sits. We are just at the northern margin of this massive Andean type orogen, which ran here from Australia through the Antarctic continent, all along the Americas. And in fact also here, Asia was in a similar situation. All over the place, contractional, peripheral mountain belts that we see here. So here in South Africa, we are just getting the northern bit of this massive, large orogen, much larger than the Andes today, much larger than the Himalayas in size. This was massive. So here we are, and here is the plate tectonic situation that we have seen before. We see here the Panthalassa Ocean being subducted underneath the Gondwana margin. This would be southern Gondwana. We don't really know whether there was an accretionary prism and a forearc basin. Certainly in some places and at some time there was, but you know the constraints that are required to form accretionary prisms and forearc basins. Otherwise, please revise this part of the course. We are seeing here a continental volcanic arc at the southern Gondwana margin, which indicates that we have partial melting of the mantle on top of the downgoing Panthalassa plate. And in the back arc, we have contraction. Here the back arc undergoes contraction. This would be the Cape Fold belt, loading the foreland and bending it down, and here we would form the foreland basin, which is the Karoo. Here is a cross-section which shows such a orogenic situation, how it typically would look like. We see here the interior of the now here eroded continental margin. Here would be intrusion of magmas in the region of the volcanic arc. Here would be perhaps the forearc with maybe a forearc basin. And here would be the back arc region, which has undergone contraction, forming these folds and these thrust folds that are indicated here with little arrows. Here we have thrusts that are stacking and piling up material due to the contraction, the north-south contraction. So in principle, that's how this southern Gondwana margin has looked like about 300 to 220 million years ago, from the forearc through the arc into the back arc. Here would be the Panthalassa subducting oceanic lithosphere, somewhere here in the south. It's not shown on this diagram. Let's have a look at this situation. We are not seeing anything of the interior of the orogen, because this is a part that has rifted off 130 million years ago, when Gondwana, southern Gondwana, broke up, and the South African coastline would be somewhere in this region here. We only see the Cape Fold belt. We only see the northern part of this orogenic system with the fold and thrust belt, and we see the foreland basin, the Cape Supergroup, which would be here in this area. We are not seeing here on this diagram the dynamics, the bending down of the lithosphere. We have seen that in one of the previous sections. The bending down of the lithosphere is shown here. The old lithosphere is flexed down, space is created for the Karoo basin. So here this is a slightly simplified version of that situation. During the rifting off, the removal of the whole interior of the southern Gondwana margin, that led to the formation of the Indian Ocean. Here we see again how these thrust sheets would look like. You see here piling up of individual sheets which once were laterally positioned to each other. So this was further south to that, and this was further south to that. And so what once was laterally positioned to each other is now vertically piled up due to the contractional tectonics and the thrusting of individual sheets on top of each other. That obviously thickens the crust, and it also thickens the whole lithosphere, because the underlying lithosphere also is contracted. And we see a typically top to the north movement. The hanging wall, the upper part of these slices, or whatever sits on top of these faults, will move to the north in the situation that we are facing here in the Cape Fault Belt. Fold and thrust belts are something quite common. We find them also in collisional environments. Here's an example of the northern Alps in Europe. Here, this is an area that we would see in southern Germany and northern Austria, where we see intense folding, typically these sharp kink-like folds, because it's a fairly shallow crustal environment. That is where such folds are forming. And we see a lot of thrusts here in dashed lines that pile up material, thicken the crust. By the way, you see these little drill rigs here. This indicates there is exploration and actually mining of hydrocarbons. Such situations can form hydrocarbon deposits. But what is important is the tectonic style here. We see these thrusts. Some of them go top to the south. This is here, for instance, the Carvendal back thrust. And here are a lot of other thrusts which go top to the north, contracting and piling up upper crustal material. Faults and fractures. Faulting, obviously, if we are talking about a fold and thrust belt, we talk about faulting. Thrusts are some sort of faults. And during faulting, we displace rocks, we form fractures, and along these fractures, we are displacing rock units. Here is a small-scale fault. You see here a marker horizon, which once was continuous. It is offset along two such fractures. And if there is offset along fractures, we call that a fault. Here's another type of fault, a thrust fault, a very famous one, the Moine thrust in Scotland. Here we see large-scale tectonic displacement indicated by these arrows, where old rocks, more than 2 billion years old rocks, are here on top. They are thrusted over younger rocks. And you know, in sedimentary strata, this should not be so. You always should have younger and younger rocks on top. Faults can change that. You can thrust older rocks on top of younger rocks. If you want to learn more about that, you can follow this link there. That is where the picture is taken from. It comes from the internet. I unfortunately have never visited these places. But you find a lot of information on the Moine thrust if you like. Other spectacular structures are folds. We see here an example from the Alps where highly ductile, soft folds are formed in deeper crustal levels, and they are now exposed at the surface in the range of the high mountains of the Swiss Alps. This rock face here is about, I think, 400 meters tall. You see large-scale folds are forming here. Different layers are getting contracted and shortened. Folding is one of the expressions when rocks are getting deformed under fairly high temperatures. We also have folds in the Cape, obviously, in a fold and thrust belt, and they occur in fact together. You see here folded quartzites of the Cape Supergroup, which have a very specific fold style, and these folds have developed while the rocks were thrusted over a fault. So here is a fault plane that ramps up here a little bit. It's a bit steeper, then it gets horizontal again, and this whole package of rocks was transported here to the left, which would be top to the north. It would be hanging wall. This is the hanging wall on top of the fault, would go up to the north, and while it was moved to the north, it underwent folding. So folding and faulting can happen at the same time in a certain level of the crust, which we call the brittle ductile transition. Brittle faulting, forming fractures, and ductile folding, deforming without making fractures, that go hand in hand in the Cape Fault Belt. And here we see a few students a few years back are standing right at this position here. So they are standing on that fault, and they're seeing here these layers are coming down vertically. That is right at this place here. where the layers, once horizontal, have been bent into a vertical position by plastic failure. Folding and bending without breaking the rock. That is plastic deformation. So here these students are busy gathering data, collecting compass readings here, for instance, in order to describe the orientation of these layers, and they're inspecting the nature of such a ramp and a flat fold on the bottom of folded strata. Here we see that in more detail. Here, that is where the fault would be, and the transport direction is top to the left. North would be here, south would be here. This is a top to the north transport movement. Of course, in the Cape we also have other faults. This is in fact Cape Supergroup already. So also the foreland basin, parts of the Karoo, the southern Karoo, have been affected by the contraction of the southern Gondwana margin, and this contraction has formed these beautiful synclinal and anticlinal folds. We are going to discuss that in more detail at a later stage. This is just at the N10, about an hour drive away from Grahamstown, a road cutting, very beautiful Cape folds, folds that have formed about 200-300 million years ago. So the last stage of evolution of the Cape Mountains, of the Cape orogen, is the breakup, the great breakup of Gondwana, rifting about 130 million years ago, formation of the Indian Ocean. So that happens here, roughly here. Here's the South African coastline. We would have a little bit of shelf that is now flooded by water of the Indian Ocean, but is still part of the continental lithosphere. And the whole internal part with the volcanic arc and the forearc and lots of interesting rocks are rifted off. They might now sit on the flooded shelf of South America. Here is this stage again shown in the Mesozoic, in the Mesozoic time period. We see here the Cape Fault Belt exists, the Karoo Basin exists, and here are the dolerite dikes that you might have heard of. The Karoo is famous for the massive intrusion of dolerites at about 150 million years ago. And they penetrate the existing Karoo Basin at the time. And here is the Cape Fault Belt. And here we see now a passive margin has developed because this whole bit of the southern Gondwana margin has rifted off. Obviously, subduction has stopped and breakup is taking place. New oceanic lithosphere is forming. This is the Indian Ocean. This is the breakup stage of Gondwana, and that is the time when all these extensional basins are forming. You see here extensional faults from the spreading of the Gondwana margin, and this forms places, structures like the Algoa Basin, in which we find today most of Port Elizabeth. Also, Oudtshoorn is sitting in one of these extensional basins. They are formed in the Jurassic and the Cretaceous. Here we see how that happens. If you extend crust, you will break it up along such folds. We call that listric normal folds. Listric is the shape, curving towards the bottom, merging into a large subhorizontal detachment fold. And normal fold, that means because the hanging wall block, the upper block, is moving downwards relatively to the block that sits at the bottom of the fold, which is the footwall block. So if you extend, if you form such fragments, such tilted blocks, because the tilting comes off because of the curvature of these listric folds, you will form space at the top, and into this space eroded material from the shoulders here, from these elevated parts. This material will be deposited in these topographic lows, and these are the basins like the Oudtshoorn Basin or the Algoa Basin or other basins that we find in the Cape. We have shown them on the map initially in yellow color. The overall structure, that we form here during extension we call grabens or half grabens. These terms will be mentioned only here. We explain them in more detail at later stages of this course and the following courses. So these are extensional tectonics. They create space, they stretch the crust, and they thin the crust. You see here, despite of deposition of new material in these basins, we are thinning out the crust in such graben or half-graben structures. Here we see where such basins are. All the yellow ones, this arrow actually should sit over here. This is the Oldthorne Basin, this is the Algoa Basin with Port Elizabeth, and there are a number of smaller ones all along the Cape Orogen. Also here we see a big one in the north. And of course we form such basins on the shelf, which is not shown here. It's to the south of the coastline that we see here. So these extensional basins have formed during Gondwana breakup 120, 130 million years ago. And this is the last stage of the Cape evolution, of the Cape Fault Belt. This was starting with the deposition of the Cape Supergroup in a back arc basin, in an extensional basin in the back arc. It was then contracted during crustal shortening, and this happened during the formation of a foreland thrust belt. And then rifting took off the interior part of this large South Gondwana margin orogen and has formed the Indian Ocean and these extensional basins in the interior of the Cape Fault Belt. Let's have a look at these basins again, these extensional tectonics. Let's just go back, to this diagram. When you see here you are tilting blocks while you are rotating material, you also continuously rotate the sediments, the new sediments that you deposit in these gaps here. This would be, for instance, a Jurassic sediment, and if displacement along this fault would carry on, also these horizontally deposited Jurassic sediments would be tilted, like the older ones here. And here we see such a situation. Old Jurassic sedimentary rocks are tilted, and they are overlain along a so-called unconformity by younger Cretaceous sediments, which are not that much tilted because they came in at a later stage of listric faulting. Underneath, somewhere must be such a listric fault, which continuously tilts whatever sits on top of them. So the Cretaceous rocks are younger, they came later, they haven't seen that much tilting, there's a little bit tilting of the layers to the left. The Jurassic ones have been tilted quite substantially. Again, the boundary in between is a unconformity. That's what we call unconformity between such differently oriented sedimentary rocks. Let's look at a sequence of sketches from Marshak's textbook. So you can find that here in chapter 4. It does not refer to necessarily to our situation that happens whenever continents break up. We see similar structures in East Africa now. Let's assume we start at 200 million years ago with a coherent southern Gondwana margin. This margin would come under extensional tectonics, and this would start breaking up the continent. This is a stage that we today see in the East African rift. Half grabens are forming, space is created, sediments are getting deposited, and the lithosphere and the crust are thinning out. You see here, compared to this thickness, in the region where the rift occurs, we are thinning out the crust. And if this rift then widens, we might have volcanic activity. That is also what we see in the East African rift today. Only if that carries on further, we will form oceanic crust. This would be a situation where then passive margins start to form. We see it today in the Red Sea, and also the South Gondwana margin has undergone such a period about 130 million years ago. And this is where we form South America and the Atlantic or the Indian Ocean with rifting along such mid-oceanic ridges with production of new lithosphere. So we see here now the widening Indian and also the Atlantic Ocean, which also is part of Gondwana breakup. South America, you also could label this here Antarctica or Australia, because also Antarctica and Australia were once part of southern Gondwana. So all these continents have broken up in the late Mesozoic via such processes. Initial rift, widening rift, magmatic activity, formation of oceanic crust, and widening of oceanic basins. And this is clearly part of the Wilson cycle with which we started this lecture. Here we can see some annotations again. The Algoa basin would represent such a state, or perhaps such a state. We don't have evidence of volcanic activity in these basins, so probably this is more applicable than that. Today's situation, Gondwana margin is a passive margin, South African plate margins, African plate margins. In the west and the south, and also the east, are passive plate margins. This also explains why we have little seismic activity, because we do not find a plate margin, we find a continental margin grading into oceanic lithosphere. The plate margins are at the respective mid-oceanic ridges in the Indian Ocean or in the Atlantic. Here we see a continuous paleogeographic evolution from 250 million years ago, Permian, to the current configuration that we see. So at 250 million years we still had the Pangaea situation with the Panthalassa Ocean surrounding it. And step by step we start separating, breaking up Pangaea, starting here in the North Atlantic. You see here Europe, North America and Africa are still together. Here we start forming the North and Central Atlantic. Here we have started forming the Southern Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. We see here India is now separated. Here it was still connected to Antarctica and to Australia here, and to Africa over here. At this stage, 70 million years ago, all of these continents are separated. Antarctica has moved to the South Pole, Australia is over here, Africa and South America are separated. There are still oceanic basins and small continental fragments between Africa, India and Asia. They are about to collide. Here, India has collided with Central Asia. And also here these small continental fragments, like the Adriatic plate here, have collided with Europe and formed the Alps and the long mountain chain that we have discussed in the last lecture. I'm going to show you now an animation, and this animation you also can download from the Jackal server. It's stored there. So have a look. Where do we find it? So here we see this file. We see early start, early situation of Pangaea breakup. It's not the full Pangaea situation 250 million years ago. You see already the North Atlantic and the Central Atlantic here have opened. We see here the African continent and the South American continent. Also here a small oceanic basin exists. Also India and Antarctica have rifted off. So this is probably something like 120 million years ago, this stage, but we will see how it evolves further until we reach the present situation. In light blue colors we see here flooded parts of the shelf. So obviously the sea levels were fairly high, and where we see these light blue colors, this is flooded shelf. Also here we have continental lithosphere underneath. Large parts of northern Europe are flooded with sediments, sedimentary rocks. This is a Cretaceous situation in the Cretaceous. You know, we had a hot climate, sea levels were high, no glaciation existed. You can see how these shelves are getting flooded during transgressive sea level rise, or they fall dry during regressions. during evolution of time. Over here we see small continental fragments between Africa and Asia. Asia would be right over here. And you also might want to have a look what India is doing. Here's India still connected to Madagascar. A rift will form along here, and the Indian subcontinent with its northern shelf will move fairly quickly northwards. You will see that during the animation. Have a look. You see now South Atlantic opens, the Indian continental plate is now separated and starts speeding up, going north. You see here in Central Africa, water is regressing, and you see here now ingression, regression. Africa moves north. The Red Sea will open here in a moment, and the Gulf of Aden, East African rift forms. We play that again. And now we have a look what happens here between Europe and Africa. We see here is a flooded continental fragment, and now it rises. Land emerges, and small continents are moving north here. Italy now becomes visible, and oceanic lithosphere disappears here, and the Alps are forming. Continent-continent collision. Africa moves north, and also here the Mediterranean, this ocean becomes smaller and smaller. Let's have a look again at this. So here, continental plates, oceanic deep water environment. Also here, small oceans are opening and closing. There's a bit of opening here now, closure. And this is when this is when Europe forms. At the same time, the Atlantic is widening. South America gets out of view. You can watch this movie again and again and think about what that means actually in terms of plate tectonics. Mid-oceanic ridges are forming, passive margins are forming. Subduction needs to take place in these regions because oceanic basins are shrinking and are disappearing. And it is followed by continent-continent collision. Also India, over here, out of view, is about colliding and forms the Himalayas. So have joy with that. This is the end of the lecture. Thank you very much.